All right, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much. Hey, look at that. I love it. You guys look good. First, I want to thank everyone for being here with us this early. And then second, and most importantly, I really want to express my appreciation to Hakeem Jefferson and to Stephen Moore for organizing this conference. Just a quick little note on this. So I actually, they don't know this, they're going to find out. I actually don't travel to the cold in the winter. I don't. I politely decline most talk invitations to the East Coast and to the Midwest for my own sanity because I do not like the cold. However, when I received this invitation from them, it took me very little time to respond with a yes. As somebody who was the only Black graduate student when I got to an institution, I fully understand the importance of having Black graduate students and also having people support them. When Hakeem and Stephen spoke, they mentioned the institutional support of different units on this campus to this conference. And I just really want to highlight again that these types of conferences don't happen in institutions. So I have never actually been invited to a conference with more than one scholar by a group of Black graduate students. In so many ways, I think this conference is history-making. I really want to thank their work and everybody who helped them to be a part of this today. So thank you. All right, so I do appreciate you keeping vigilant time here, so I'm gonna try to run through some things. Okay. All right, so in the evening on August 11th, 2017, white nationalists and neo-Nazis marched on Charlottesville, Virginia with tiki torches, giving the Nazi salute and chanting phrases such as "White Lives Matter." They came from all over the country, even as far as the liberal enclave as Berkeley, California. Their mission, which they all chose to accept it seemingly, was to stop the nation from ending the power of white men. The anger on their faces was palatable in the glow of the torches. These young men continued their onslaught at an afternoon rally the following day at a park featuring a prominent statue of Robert E. Lee, the top Confederate Army commander, which was slated to be removed finally. By this time, word had gotten out and the nation's media had descended on Charlottesville. Counter-protesters also got organized with signs reading "Black Lives Matter" and "Love, Not Hate." Police decked out in militarized gear attempted to prepare for the inevitable. Charlottesville was a powder keg ready to explode, and it did. At 2 p.m., a neo-Nazi deliberately drove a car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing one woman and injuring many more. This was the face of white rage, ready to kill even white people if necessary, to protect against a society that was slowly beginning to become more inclusive by tearing down symbols of white supremacy. The images of the violent mob of mostly white men sent shockwaves through a nation deeply divided by race. I received emails from former students and texts from friends. Everyone seemed to be so stunned about Charlottesville. It was a similar level of disbelief, phone calls and texts that I received from friends and colleagues after we find out that another unarmed African American has been killed by private citizens or by a law enforcement officer. And I confess that this widespread sense of shock confuses me. The displays of state-sanctioned violence, white supremacy, and the killing of Black folk that has invaded my TV and social media in the last 4 years is not something out of the norm. It is not aberrational. It is a defining, I believe, feature of American politics. My research on American political and constitutional development has taught me that white supremacy and state violence is the rule and certainly not the exception. I do not think that there has ever been a time that we have lived without its effects. I cannot point you to a time frame in American politics in which white people were not, in which non-white people, were not persecuted. It simply does not exist. These are not new problems. They did not arrive in our political world with Trump and or with social media. Writing about Charlottesville, the great poet Claudia Rankine wrote about her confusion, and I love it because it at some level mirrors how I feel. She says, and I'm going to quote here, "I felt Charlottesville to be an everyday kind of condition, even as others described it as an unnameable terror. The KKK, white supremacists, and the alt-right were being referred to as if they beamed down into our democracy, right? Like some type of like aliens." Rankine then goes on to draw out how in 2017, some groups were considered the source of white supremacy rather than its amplification. And I want to say this again. In 2018, I think right now, some groups, Trump, Bannon, so-called rural white voters, are considered the source of white supremacy and violence and not its amplification. And this is an important distinction, I think. Where we are right now, like I've said before, is not incredibly new. It is an amplification of what was. It's an amplification of our inability to appropriately come to grips with our violent political history. But even if the events in Charlottesville are not entirely new, as I have alleged, Charlottesville is still a historic moment in modern American politics, a moment that reveals something significant about the inescapability of our racial past. So I want to understand Charlottesville today, but Charlottesville is a stand-in or a symbol of the larger, complicated contemporary racial moment. And I want to do that historically through a focus on two periods where I have conducted research. First being the project that I'm working on right now, focused on the post-Civil War South as a place to understand the long history and the buildup of our criminal justice system. And then second, the violence enacted upon blacks via lynching and mob violence during the period of Jim and Jane Crow, as well as the attempts of African Americans to organize against state violence. I chronicle this latter part in my first book, Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State. The book tries to make a claim about how black citizens constructed civil rights in American politics during the darkest of times. All right, so I gotta do a bunch in like 15 minutes. All right, let's see what we can do, y'all. Okay. All right, so when we think about criminal justice, we normally tell one type of story, right? It's seemingly, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, I think, is significant here. We tell a story that often focuses, or at least centralizes the war on drugs. It begins kind of the timeline of the 80s, 70s, and 80s gets pushed back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s to understand what happened there. And like any good political story, the traditional story about the development of a racist criminal justice system in this country has its villains, right? Hey, look at that, right? We got some villains. We got these two, right? Okay, so what I want to do today is to think about how we might tell the story in a new way, specifically how we might think about explaining the development of criminal justice from even a longer standpoint. So I'm going to propose that I don't think you can understand the contemporary criminal justice system without understanding or discussing the post-Civil War industrialization and the growth of capitalism. All right, so I'm going to run through this, okay? And I'm happy to talk about anything more afterwards. All right, so something that I got really interested in was about how did the South rebuild after the Civil War, and what happened in the aftermath of Reconstruction. I began a book project focused on the development and the rise of the criminal justice system in the aftermath of Reconstruction, as the system of criminal justice as being a way in which African American rights were actually stripped. But that historical work actually took me further. And it actually pushed me to focus on the end of the Civil War period. I got really interested in how did the South rebuild, right? So we understand one of these pictures is the Battle of Atlanta, the other one is the Battle of Chattanooga in Tennessee. And we know in terms of after the Civil War, not in all southern states, but in many southern states, we know that crops were ruined, that factories were crumbling, right? Union troops came in and demolished a lot of the roads in the South as well. But we know that the South rebuilt. And I can do this, and I've done this with many southern cities. And probably about a 3, 4, 5 decade time span, the South rebuilds, somehow in the absence of slavery. So I've tried to understand what happens from about approximately, it fudges depending on what state you're looking at, between 1865 and 1910. We have this curious period of American political development in which there's some work, but not a lot. I think that there's a story to be told here about state building. So a lot of the scholarship, especially that tries to understand what happened in the aftermath of slavery and how did black political rights that were exercised during the period of Reconstruction, how are those undermined? All right, let's try to, okay. I think the underbelly of this story centers on a buildup and the beginning process of a formalization of the criminal justice system as being kind of a middle way between the institution of slavery and then what happens afterwards. All right. All right, so I'm going to propose something. This is, again, something that I'm still working on right now, still thinking through. But again, I really want to try to problematize how we think about a longer time frame for the development of criminal justice in this country. All right, so the South after the Civil War is going to face two big problems. One, how to restore an economy that was dependent on forced black labor. And the other one, right, which is big, is in terms of how do you return or how do you moderate a system in terms of racial power dynamics that existed under slavery, and then we have this new period called Reconstruction. So what we do know, of course, many historians have told us, is that the South passed new laws, many of which were under the term kind of black codes, other ones in which the states and cities passed independently. What we do know, of course, is that these new laws, many criminal laws that were on the books, were practiced in a discriminatory manner. We then know that African Americans then went to these jails and also, and sometimes, obviously, penitentiaries. We know, though, of course, that especially in the time period after the Civil War, that many jails, local jails, and state penitentiaries were crumbled, were just not actually there. The kind of the one that existed in a very good state after the Civil War was actually in Texas, but most other states did not have a place where they could actually hold individuals. As a result, let's do this first. So these were there's obviously a long list of different criminal laws that were passed, some curfew laws, right, so that if you were out after sundown, you could be arrested. If you were out under a certain time, vagrancy laws, right, if you were unemployed, public fighting, firearms laws. And so what I want to center and what I've been working on over the last 2-3 years here is a project that looks at convict leasing and chain gangs, wanting to understand at some level labor that isn't forced labor, but also labor that isn't free. So how do we understand unfree labor in this country, and how does it relate to a system of criminal justice? My ideas here and the ways that I'm trying to think about it is that the system of convict leasing, and for those who don't know, the problem that I just described in terms of growing numbers of African Americans who are in jail, but the state without the resources to actually hold them in terms of institutions and also funding, is that then we know for sure is that plantations and northern and also southern industry then approach Southern governments with at some level in their minds, genius idea that they would pay states for the use of these so-called convicts, right? And that they would also then house these individuals, right, and take care of them. So in some ways, for many states, it was a win-win, that they would get money per convict, and they also would not actually have to hold them, that they could at some level outsource the responsibility for these individuals. All right. Again, I'm running quickly through this. One of the big companies that I focus on in the development of the convict lease system is I center on the state of Alabama, and in particular, I focus on the Tennessee Coal Iron and Railroad Company. It's going to be Tennessee Coal and Iron Railroad Company is going to be one of the, behind U.S. Steel, the second biggest company in the country that focuses on steel. It's going to be one of the first 12 stocks that is listed on the Dow Jones Industrial Average when it starts. J.P. Morgan is going to be one of the biggest investors in Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. The reason why I'm focusing on Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company in my work is in part because they get the contract for all of Alabama's convicts, as well as a portion of Tennessee's convicts as well. We know for sure that Tennessee Coal, Iron, Railroad Company is seen as kind of this it's Southern industrialization and modernization, but it is also a company that is built from the ground from mostly black convict labor. I want to understand, this is something, it's not totally refined at all, but one of the things, especially in the subfield that I work at in political science, is a subfield that often looks to history to understand patterns, right? This idea that when we have things where we are right now, it's not just that one damn thing happens after another, right? That there's at some level a method to American madness, right? To American political history. All right, so the ways I've tried to understand this here is in some ways, and this is, again, it's not totally neat here, but if we can think about a first Reconstruction and then a second Reconstruction, and so one of the things I'm trying to understand is the ways in which the criminal justice system is used as a way to, at some level, contract around periods of increasing black political rights and freedom. Right, and so we know, of course, in the first Reconstruction, or as I'm proposing, right, we have the passage of these, right, important laws for African American civil rights. We then have very quickly, right after that, the passage of new Southern laws, mostly, obviously, under the Black Codes. Then we have a dramatic new incarceration of African Americans in many Southern states. We then have, obviously, an overflowing of jails and the outsourcing and the care of these individuals to private companies. We, of course, and obviously what has been focused a lot more on in scholarship and in the press is what has happened in the second Reconstruction, that after kind of the heyday of the civil rights movement, many landmark decisions from the Supreme Court, as well as the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. We then, of course, know that different presidents used the law and a trumped-up war on drugs to incarcerate new numbers of black and brown people. Right? We also then know felon disenfranchisement happened as a result, overflowing jails, and also the privatization, not of all, right, but of some. All right. Okay, that's one aspect. All right, I have like 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes? 2:30. Oh my gosh, okay. We're gonna try to do, okay. We know though, right, that at the end, and the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th, that things did not completely end, that the criminal justice system and state violence continues to be a form of oppression for African Americans. All right. All right, so my first book project looks at the NAACP's campaign against racial violence in the first quarter of the 20th century. I'm very much, and I still am, very interested in the ways that the state uses its institutions against people of color. I think it's really important for me to also say that the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement is not making an entirely new set of claims about the persistence of racial violence. In general, I think the American public knows very little about the tradition of Black Lives Matter protest of African Americans against state violence. I think the most important figure for understanding the history of Black Lives Matter is Ida B. Wells, who at the end, we know, of the 19th century, investigated lynchings and mob violence and produced the first reports, statistics of lynchings of African American men and of African American women. The NAACP would pick up off of her trailblazing work in 1909 when the NAACP started. And part of the reason why I wanted to write this book is to push back, I know, against a dominant narrative about civil rights in the NAACP that very much focuses on education and voting rights. In so many ways, if you read through the first 3 decades of the NAACP's archives, you see an organization that is so consumed with the issue of racial violence, specifically lynching and mob violence. In their minds, and I like to use this quote sometimes when I discuss the NAACP's campaign against racial violence, there was this interesting board meeting. Many people know the NAACP's board was all white with the exception of Du Bois. But two of the white board members had said they were confused why the NAACP wasn't going after other areas. Oh my gosh, all right, I'm gonna take a minute. Other areas of justifiably important civil rights issues such as education. And then Du Bois responds, and he says here, all the American Negro wants is a chance to live without a rope around his neck, right, end quote. And this is the idea that before we can fight for other rights, such as education and voting, that we first need to fight for the right of African Americans to live free from state violence. I'm gonna have 3 more sentences, and then I promise I'm gonna be done here. I see Christian looking at me like I'm crazy. All right, because did not get to 8 of my slides.
Like that crazy, like I'm supposed to.
Yeah, I know. My goodness. All right, I'm gonna close though. Okay. In terms of, so my title for my talk today was "The Strange Fruit of American Politics," and that's in part because I've spent a long time thinking about the silences that exist in American political history and also in American politics. In 1933, Billie Holiday, a celebrated African-American jazz singer, recorded "Strange Fruit," a protest song about the horrific violence of the lynching of African Americans. Holiday endeavored to bring attention to lynchings and frequently sang the song, the haunting song, during live performances to draw attention to the precarity of Black life. The singing of "Strange Fruit" in front of well-heeled white audiences should be read, I believe, as a form of calculated resistance by Holiday, meant to highlight the inescapability of spectacular racial violence that existed throughout the country at the time. I invoke "Strange Fruit" in the title of my talk today as a way to think about the violence of our silence in American politics research when we ignore the impact of state-sanctioned racial violence on political and constitutional development. When scholarship discounts the importance of racial violence during different moments of state building, it becomes, I think, complicit in the production of a sanitized and ultimately dangerous form of history-making and of scholarship. The strange fruit of American politics is that racial violence has been one of the few constants in American politics, and yet we do not name it as such in our research, and we do not talk about it as such in media. That's it. Thanks.